happy with durian chocolate.
Yes.
We need to thank Professor Broussard for sharing those with us.
Yes.
And he wants to keep the rest to himself. Anyway, let's continue. Yeah.
I believe in writing and rewriting until someone steals manuscript from you. But, so I had started, I'm referring now to the last question that Goran asked about, is Mary Douglas saying that political humor is not transgressive? And I had had a previous sentence that started this section, because I end with a discussion of this is humor, and I said, but nobody thought the Haitian Revolution was a joke. So yes, I agree with you, but I like Douglas anyway. So I start without that sentence, which I had taken out this morning. In August of 1791, close to 100,000 slaves rose up against the planters of Saint Domingue, France's, and indeed the world's richest and most brutal. I think I'd take that out. Suriname was certainly very, very brutal. Anyway, the world's richest slave plantation economy. And the slaves raped and murdered, pillaged and burned plantations from the Pont du Nord in the mountains to the mountainside south of Port-au-Prince. In other words, the whole island. This was not an impromptu act of rage, but a carefully planned and coordinated uprising, the beginning of a 10-year war that led to the abolition of slavery throughout the French Empire, if only momentarily, the establishment of the first independent black state outside of Africa, and the world's second post-colonial nation. By 1804, the United States no longer stood alone as the flag bearer of liberty. It now had a black brother. The Haitian Revolution, Laurent Dubois tells us, did even more. It opened up, quote, new spaces for the political imagination. While Enlightenment liberalism may have had its origins in Europe, Du Bois argues, it found its fulfillment in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution generated, and I quote again, generated what we view today as the true thinking of the Enlightenment, a concrete and radical universalism that overthrew profit for principle and defended human rights against the weapons of empire and the arguments of racial hierarchy. Haitian revolutionaries went far beyond participants in either the United States or the French Revolution, imagining a world built upon freedom and political sovereignty of all men, regardless of race or place of birth. Haiti was the first slave-free nation in the history of the world, the first nation to inscribe liberalism's vision of man's equality and inalienable rights into its constitution. In Robin Blackburn's words, Saint Domingue's army of revolutionary blacks redeemed the age of revolution. Redeemed and terrified it. And not only because of the ruthlessness with which black revolutionaries seized and maintained their freedom. What the watching white world found far more terrifying, Blackburn argues, was the revolutionaries' implementation of emancipation as a state policy, and the tangible proof they provided that formerly enslaved Africans and Afro-Caribbeans could not only defeat Napoleon's heretofore victorious army and Europe's most formidable military machine, but could establish an independent country based on the principle of self-governance. They proved that illiterate slaves could not only gain their freedom, but restore law and order and economic productivity to a ravaged country, engage actively in global commerce, and successfully negotiate the minefield of the late 18th century diplomatic relations. Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe all successfully played France, Spain, Britain, and the United States against one another to secure a free and independent Haiti. In short, they fundamentally challenged Enlightenment liberalism, racially exclusionary assumptions and practices. From the perspective of the white Atlantic, this was indeed a world turned upside down. In the years leading to the Haitian Revolution, no one in the white Atlantic had thought such a thing possible. Not even Renaud believed that men raised as slaves could become independent, rational political actors. These stupid men, he wrote, would be incapable of conducting themselves. They would spend their lives in habitual indolence or in the commission of all kinds of crime. The great benefit of liberty must be preserved for their posterity, and even that with some modification. These children, till they attain their 20th year, should belong to the masters of the manufacture or plantations where they were born, in order that he may be reimbursed for the expenses which he will have been obliged to incur for their bringing up. The 5 following years they should still be obliged to serve him, but for a stipulated salary settled by the law. After this time they should be independent, provided their conduct justified freedom. Indeed, Renaud voiced the very logic that lay behind the systems of gradual emancipation adopted by the United States northern states in the years following their revolution, and would guide the first steps of emancipation in the British Caribbean. In sharp contrast, Saint Domingue's slaves insisted and proved that they were fully capable of political agency and responsible self-governance. As rumors of slave revolts followed hard upon the actual slave uprisings, and there were slave revolts at this time throughout Central America, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, and Virginia. Slaveholders from Guadeloupe to Charleston, Baltimore to Jamaica, wondered what the future held. Could the institution of slavery be secure in a world menaced by barbarous slaves and equally barbarous sans-culottes, who called for the blood of kings and aristocrats and condemned planters as aristocrats of the skin? Of course, the United States Constitution defended the rights of slaveholders in numerous ways, but would they prove sufficient in a radicalizing world? New political coalitions had to be formed. Gradually over the 1790s, Jefferson and Madison constructed a powerful new political alliance, and I'm pointing to them because they were considered the most radical of American liberals. They created a powerful new political alliance, albeit one composed of strange bedfellows, which we've discussed already, Southern planters, increasingly socially and politically conservative, united with Northern white radicals who saw their struggle to democratize American polity simultaneously as a domestic and an international struggle. Both components of this coalition felt they lived in perilous times. Slaveholders saw themselves endangered by revolutionary blacks and an international anti-slavery movement, at the same time as federalist domestic legislation seemed designed to marginalize them economically and politically. Northern radicals, alienated by the Federalist restrictive immigration legislation, the Federalist close ties to Great Britain, the excise taxes of Alexander Hamilton, the forceful suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion, they saw the Federalist agenda as part of an international conspiracy led by European monarchies to destroy the French Revolution and crush democratic institutions throughout the world. If the French Republic fell, they were sure their own republic would be next. Fearing disasters they believed only too imminent, both Southern slaveholders and Northern radicals embraced the Jeffersonian Republican coalition as their only lifeline in a raging sea of revolution and counter-revolution. It is within this complex context that we must read the American popular press's representations of Saint Domingue and its revolutionary army. For Southerners, the issue was clear. Saint Domingue threatened the security of their world. If it could not be repressed, the slaves' uprising must be contained. French Negroes, as they were called, must be excluded from the southern states. Sympathy and relief must be offered to suffering whites seeking refuge from black violence. Time and again one finds such sentiments expressed in Charleston and Baltimore newspapers, these are enslaved states. Sentiments northern newspapers disseminated widely, but they didn't actually initiate them. Sentiment posed a far more challenging problem for northern radicals. Before slaves rose in Saint Domingue, a number of white northern Republicans had publicly embraced the anti-slavery cause and attacked slavery. Most northern radicals saw themselves as part of an international movement dedicated to the spread of democratic principles around the world. They hailed Jefferson's ringing pronouncement that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. They embraced the French Revolution and its growing radicalism, celebrated Tom Paine's rights of man. A number were refugees from British political oppression and had belonged to the London Corresponding Society, or alternatively had participated in the United Irishmen's uprising. The most radical of these political emigres embraced a vision of cosmopolitan or universal citizenship, insisting that all men were endowed with unalienable rights and that these rights were invested in each individual and thus transcended national boundaries and national belonging. Wherever free men resided, John Burke, one of the United Irishmen's most radical leaders, they were virtual citizens of that country, regardless of that country's reaction. And in the case of John Adams' Federalist administration, those reactions were quite hostile. In fact, Burke had to flee Massachusetts and move to Virginia, where Jefferson basically said U.S. law did not extend and that he would be safe from persecution by the Federalist courts. It was a young country still. The government that refused to recognize them as citizens, Burke claimed, was tyrannical. John Binns, another Irish emigre, concurred. He became an American, Patrick Riley tells us, not upon taking a formal oath of citizenship, but when, days after first landing in this country, he saw a Pennsylvania militia company at drill under the banner Virtue, Liberty, and Independence. It was then, Binns wrote in his autobiography, under the broad expanse of heaven, without the adoption of any form of words, I took my first oath of allegiance and fidelity to the United States, an oath which I have faithfully kept. Riley calls such radical revisioning of citizenship volitional allegiance. Now, how could such cosmopolitan Republicans refuse to applaud the struggle of Saint Domingue's slaves for freedom and independence? How could they fail to embrace them as Republican brothers? They could and emphatically did. Most obviously in order to maintain the Jeffersonian Republican coalition, so critical to their larger cosmopolitan vision and to winning Southern support for liberal immigration policies. Protection of American slavery was the price of participation in that coalition. But I believe a second equally important consideration drove their rejection of Haiti's revolution, their vision of a homogeneous liberal polity. Liberal Republicans based their legitimacy on the will of the people. Liberal republics based their legitimacy on the will of the people. They existed to serve the needs of the people and to protect their interests. But who were the people? That entity that had authored the U.S. Constitution. We the people of the United States, our Constitution starts in order to, etc. And we all have memorized that. It's in our bloodstream, I suppose, no matter how recently our parents or grandparents emigrated here. So the question is, who were the people? To Northern Jeffersonian Republicans, Andrew Shankman tells us, the people were not the multiple heterogeneous groupings that encompassed all of America's inhabitants, black, white, immigrant, native born women, men. Rather, Shankman explains, by the people, Northern Republicans meant that homogeneous group invested with the right to vote and possess property. It was the needs of this group, Shankman continues, that radicals insisted republics existed to protect and foster. Now you would think these would be conservative, sort of Burkean types, but it was the radicals as well who had this vision of the people. In a world in which African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans were far more often property than property owners, and in which African Americans, free as well as enslaved, were formally and informally excluded from the political arena, it was not easy to include them among the people. Republican governance. It was easy not to include them, It was easy not to include them among the people Republican governance existed to protect. Patrick Riley states the argument even more directly. In their long struggle to democratize the American polity, he explained, Northern Republican radicals drew a circle of whiteness that excluded blacks from the public life. Excluding those of African descent from their vision of the American polity, Jeffersonian Republicans exemplified enlightened liberalism's fear of difference. The Enlightenment's fundamental concept of the human being as a rights-bearing political subject grew out of an insistence on the equality, the sameness of all men. We discussed this on Monday. Difference, be it gendered, racial, or cultural, introduces problems liberal theory is ill-equipped to handle. As a consequence, liberalism views difference with alarm. And what more alarming vision of difference exists than that of enraged and murderous blacks bent on the destruction of civilized white society? A complex mix of these varied factors, I suggest, led Northern Jeffersonian Republicans to turn their backs on the Haitian Revolution, to redefine the promises of liberalism in exclusionary, racialized terms, to imagine the United States as a white man's refuge and unalienable rights as white men's exclusive property. As I said earlier, we can witness the birth of white nationalism on the pages of the new United States white liberal press. Theories can fascinate. However, without historical evidence to support them, they will often fail to convince. With this in mind, let us look at the popular press's representation of the Haitian Revolution, and in particular at the leading Jeffersonian Republican paper at the time, published in Philadelphia, then the nation's capital, Benjamin Franklin Bosch's American General Advertiser. And Benjamin Franklin Bosch, as his name suggests, was the nephew of Benjamin Franklin, who was also opposed to slavery, but thought maybe they should be colonized and get out of the country. He was also not very fond of Native Americans. I will focus on the months surrounding one of the most dramatic incidents in the Haitian Revolution, the burning of Le Cap François in the summer of 1793. Relatively early in both the Haitian and the French revolutions, and when support for the French Revolution was continued to be very strong in the United States, most especially, of course, among radicals. I choose Bosch and his paper precisely because he and it embraced radical Enlightenment principles, most especially the insistence on the sameness, the equality of all men, and their claim to equal political rights and agency. As I discussed on Monday, moderate Enlightenment, the thinkers Locke, Voltaire, David Hume, and Adam Ferguson, continue to defend social and political inequalities in contrast to radical Enlightenment writers such as Diderot, Renaud, Paine, and Benjamin Franklin Bosch. These radicals condemned inequality in all its form, and most especially chattel slavery. But the burning of Le Cap tested the true mettle of their commitment to racial equality. White revolutionary violence did not alarm them. Not the storming of the Bastille, the sans-culottes orchestrated street violence, the beheadings of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Was black political violence of a different matter? how would they represent the burning of Le François? I ask people to apologize by terrible French accents. Celebrated as the Paris of the West, Le Cap was an emblem of French culture transposed to the Americas. It was celebrated for its cultural institutions, theaters, bookstores, scientific societies, along with the wealth, sophistication, and libertinage of its inhabitants. For whites throughout the Americas, and most especially in the nascent U.S. Republic, Le Cap proved that transplanted Europeans could produce culture every bit as refined and elegant as those who remained in Europe or Britain. It proved American settlers the equals of the culture of Europe and of Britain. The burning of Le Cap by hordes of rebellious blacks, the slaughter of its cultured inhabitants, the destruction of its opera house, its theaters and bookstores, demonstrated the fragility of transplanted cultures and consequently of their own, be it in Philadelphia, Brazil, or Mexico. Excuse me. To those critical of the French Revolution and of the Haitian Revolution in particular, the burning of Le Cap epitomized as well the horrors of unrestrained black liberty and black license. Despite radical Republicans' continued embrace of the French Revolution, the burning of Le Cap horrified them as well. Even the most radical of the radical Republicans refused to draw parallels between white violence during the U.S. and French revolutions and the burning of Le Cap. And now I think we come up with our question again of how can people see parallels where we see them? Or why don't they see parallels where we do see them? A close reading of the General Advertiser, I contend, will throw light on the processes that lay behind radical liberals' refusal to connect the dots, their exclusion of black Haitians from membership in the Atlantic liberal polity. The winter and spring of 1792-1793 saw Saint Domingue torn asunder by contesting forces. Jacobin commissioners sent by the French National Assembly, Saint Domingue's royalist planter and mercantile elites, white Creole artisans who embraced the revolution in France but detested blacks and the planter elite with equal intensity, free mulattoes politically empowered by early French Republican edicts. All savagely battled one another. White governing systems fractured, civil institutions and courts ceased to operate, rampaging slaves seized the countryside, terrified planters huddled in the island's few port cities, newly politically empowered mulattoes contested for power and status with rebellious black slaves, royalist planters and army officers plotted against the Jacobin commissioners, British forces invaded Saint Domingue's western coast, armies of former slaves joined Spanish forces to invade from the east, atrocities abounded on all sides, yellow fever ravaged French and British troops, sugar production ground to a halt, munitions, even food were scarce. Then between June 20th and June 22nd, violence broke out in Le Cap. As planters, white artisans, sailors, and marines from the French fleet at anchor in the harbor and commanded by pro-slavery General Carroll, sought to overthrow the commissioners and deport them to France. Success seemed certain until the commissioners appealed to a black army camped outside the gates of the city, promising freedom and equal status to all black warriors who would fight for the Republic. We promised them liberty in the name of the Republic, the commissioners stated in their official report to the National Assembly, and declared that all those who took up arms for her would become the equals of their former masters. The black rebels assented, pushing Galbo's forces back to the harbor. then looted and burnt the city. Galvaux and as many whites as who could find space on the hundreds of ships anchored there sought safety in flight. Meanwhile, in Saint Domingue, Sonothax and Carroll, the Republic's commissioners, acting jointly with the black General Toussaint Louverture, proclaimed the abolition of slavery, which within a year the French National Convention in Paris endorsed, abolishing slavery throughout its Caribbean empire. Former slaves were voted members of the National Assembly. From the flames of a cup, a free Saint Domingue emerged. Of course, Saint Domingue's planters, U.S. slaveholders, and many even among the Northern radicals viewed the burning of Lecoq and subsequent violence with alarm. Initial news of Lecoq's destruction was carried to the United States by ship captains and distraught passengers on General Galvaux's fleeing flotilla. Once here, news was disseminated quickly on the pages of avidly read newspapers. The news first arrived in Philadelphia on July 10th in a report by Captain Fanny of the brig Union, 14 days out of Francois. Mulattoes and Negro slaves, Fanny reported, encouraged by the French commissioners, had carried out an indiscriminate massacre of both sexes. Men, women, and children were cut to pieces to the number of between 8,000 and 10,000. After which the wretches plundered and set fire to the town. Those whites who could escape, Captain Fanny reported, sailed in a convoy of 250 vessels, of which Fanny's ship was one, bound to the United States, and under the protection of 2 French 74s and 5 French frigates. On the same page, 2 other stories dated July 5th and July 6th contained equally shocking information, this time gathered from Captain White of the schooner Barbary. White informed presumably horrified white American readers that fighting broke out after the commissioners had broken General Galvaux for misconduct, ordering him back to France and ordering members of the French fleet confined to their ships after 9 in the evening. The seamen had then risen up under Galvaux's leadership and engaged with mulatto members of the Republican Army. Chaos broke out as white sailors, royalist planters, and Republican but anti-black artisans battled mulattoes and a growing number of black slaves. From a white perspective, the scene was terrifying. Echoing Captain Fanny, Captain White reported the Negroes spared neither men, women, or children. Women and others who had locked themselves up in their dwelling houses in order for protection on the fire reaching them were seen leaping from the 2nd story, and on their being taken up, as nothing seemed too inhuman for those desperadoes, were immediately thrown into the flames. An unnamed French gentleman on board White's ship added details. They say that all the whites who had been sheltered in the barracks where they had been conducted were unmercifully murdered by order of the chiefs of the brigands. Neither women nor children were spared. The same day, a number of whites who ran towards the harbor to escape the ferocity of the insurgents were killed. The conflagration began at daybreak and continued all the night. On July 12th, the 3rd day of reporting, however, a new note was sounded. Bosch included in his paper a statement from the French Patriotic Society of Philadelphia, echoing rhetoric deployed against the French aristocrats during the opening days of the French Revolution. The Society opposed the travelers' reports, firmly stating that the Society, quote, does not in any manner approve of the conduct of the greatest number of the colonists, in other words, the slaveholding planters and merchants. They are convinced that their prejudice and their aristocracy of color, not less abusive and prejudicial to mankind as the heretofore French nobles, have been the principal causes of the evil which now assail them. The Society, along with the French ambassador to the U.S., Charles Genet, then commanded the commissioners, whose courage and energetic conduct must inspire the friends of the French Republic with greatest confidence, adding, their tried patriotism and abilities will, we trust, empower them honorably through the perilous circumstances in which they are involved. Nevertheless, the society continued, those who landed on America's shores were destitute. They must be aided. Even Ambassador Genet contributed his own money as well as time and effort to their care. In this way, white privilege prevailed. Those who had enslaved and exploited black slaves continued to evoke sympathy and succor from their fellow whites. A correspondent from Baltimore sounded much the same thing in a letter printed in the General Advertiser 3 days later on July 15.